Just making sure spelling's good. Ready? All right. So, Das Kapital. Avery. So I'm going to skip as usual. I'm going to skip over the introduction because it's the introduction by Friedrich Engels to the English edition. So we'll just start and see how confusing this is. Part 1: Commodities and Money. Commodities. The two factors of a commodity: use value and value, the substance of value and the magnitude of value. The wealth of those societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails presents itself as an immense accumulation of commodities, its unit being a single commodity. Our investigation must therefore begin with the analysis of a commodity. A commodity is, in the first place, an object outside us, a thing that by its properties satisfies human wants of some sort or another. The nature of such wants, whether for instance they spring from the stomach or from fancy, makes no difference. Neither are we here concerned to know how the object satisfies these wants, whether directly as means of subsistence or indirectly as means of production. Every useful thing, as iron, paper, etc., may be looked at from the 2 points of view of quality and quantity. It is an assemblage of many properties and may therefore be of use in various ways. To discover the various uses of things is the work of history. So also is the establishment of socially recognized standards of measure for the quantities of these useful objects. The diversity of these measures has its origin partly in the diverse nature of the objects to be measured, partly in convention. The utility of a thing makes it a use value. But this utility is not a thing of air. Being limited by the physical properties of the commodity, it has no existence apart from that commodity. A commodity, such as iron, corn, or a diamond, is therefore, so far as it is a material thing, a use value, something useful. This property of a commodity is independent of the amount of labor required to appropriate its useful qualities. When treating of use value, we always assume to be dealing with definite quantities, such as dozens of watches, yards of linen, or tons of iron. The use values of commodities furnish the material for a special study, that of the commercial knowledge of commodities. Use values become a reality only by use or consumption. They also constitute the substance of all wealth, whatever may be the social form of that wealth. In the form of society we are about to consider, they are, in addition, the material depositories of exchange value. Exchange value, at first sight, presents itself as a quantitative relation, as the proportion in which values in use of one sort are exchanged for those of another sort, a relation constantly changing with time and place. Hence, exchange value appears to be something accidental and purely relative, and consequently an intrinsic value, i.e., an exchange value that is inseparably connected with, inherent in commodities, seems a contradiction in terms. Let us consider the matter a little more closely. A given commodity, for example, a quarter of wheat in exchange for X blacking, Y silk, or Z gold, etc., in short, for other commodities in the most different proportions, instead of one exchange value, the wheat has, therefore, a great many, but since X blacking, Y silk, or Z gold, etc., each represents the exchange value of 1/4 of wheat. X blacking, Y silk, Z gold, etc., must as exchange values be replaceable by each other or equal to each other. Therefore, first, the valid exchange values of a given commodity express something equal. Secondly, exchange value generally is only the mode of expression, the phenomenal form of something contained in it, yet distinguishable from it. Let us take two commodities, for example, corn and iron. The proportions in which they are exchangeable, whatever those proportions may be, can always be represented by an equation in which a given quantity of corn is equated to some quantity of iron. For example, 1/4 corn equals X quantity iron. What does this equation tell us? It tells us that in two different things, in 1/4 of corn and X quarter of iron, there exists in equal quantities something common to both. The two things must therefore be equal to a third, which in itself is neither the one nor the other. Each of them, so far as it is exchange value, must therefore be reducible to this third. A simple geometrical illustration will make this clear. In order to calculate and compare the areas of rectilinear figures, we decompose them into triangles, but the area of the triangle itself is expressed by something totally different from its visible figure, namely by half the product of the base multiplied by the altitude. In the same way, the exchange values of commodities must be capable of being expressed in terms of something common to them all, of which thing they represent a greater or less quantity. This common something cannot be either a geometrical, a chemical, or any other natural property of commodities. Such properties claim our attention only in so far as they affect the utility of those commodities, make them use values. But the exchange of commodities is evidently an act characterized by a total abstraction from use value. Then one use value is just as good as another, provided only it be present in sufficient quantity, or, as old Barbon says, one sort of wares are as good as another, if the values be equal. There is no difference or distinction in things of equal value. An 100 pounds worth of lead or iron is of as great value as 100 pounds worth of silver or gold. As use values, commodities are, above all, of different qualities, but as exchange values they are merely different quantities, and consequently do not contain an atom of use value. If then we leave out of consideration the use value of commodities, they have only one common property left, that of being products of labor. But even the product of labor itself has undergone a change in our hands. If we make abstraction from its use value, we make abstraction at the same time from the material elements and shapes that make the product a use value. We see it no longer a table, a house, yarn, or any other useful thing. Its existence as a material thing is put out of sight. Neither can it any longer be regarded as the product of the labor of the joiner, the mason, the spinner, or any other definite kind of productive labor. Along with the useful qualities of the products themselves, we put out of sight both the useful character of the various kinds of labor embodied in them, and the concrete forms of that labor. There is nothing left but what is common to them all. All are reduced to one and the same sort of labor, human labor in the abstract. Let us now consider the residue of each of these products. It consists of the same unsubstantial reality in each, a mere congelation of homogeneous human labor, of labor power expended without regard to the mode of its expenditure. All that these things now tell us is that human labor power has been expended in their production, that human labor is embodied in them. When looked at as crystals of this social substance, common to them all, they are values. We have seen that when commodities are exchanged, their exchange value manifests itself as something totally independent of their use value. But if we abstract from their use value, there remains their value as defined above. Therefore, the common substance that manifests itself in the exchange of value of commodities, whenever they are exchanged, is their value. The progress of our investigation will show that exchange value is the only form in which the value of commodities can manifest itself or be expressed. For the present, however, we have to consider the nature of value independently of this, its form. A use value, or useful article, therefore, has value only because human labor in the abstract has been embodied or materialized in it. How, then, is the magnitude of this value to be measured? Plainly, by the quantity of the value creating substance, the labor contained in the article. The quantity of labor, however, is measured by its duration, and labor time, in its turn, finds its standard in weeks, days, and hours. Some people might think that if the value of a commodity is determined by the quantity of labor spent on it, the more idle and unskillful the laborer, the more valuable would his commodity be, because more time would be required in its production. The labor, however, that forms the substance of value is homogeneous human labor, expenditure of one uniform labor power, the total labor power of society, which is embodied in the sum total of the values of all commodities produced by that society, counts here as one homogeneous mass of human labor power, composed though it be of innumerable individual units. Each of these units is the same as any other, so far as it has the character of the average labor power of society, and takes effect as such. That is, so far as it requires for producing a commodity no more time than is needed on an average, no more than is socially necessary. The labor time socially necessary is that required to produce an article under the normal conditions of production, and with the average degree of skill and intensity prevalent at the time. The introduction of power looms into England probably reduced by one half the labor required to weave a given quantity of yarn into cloth. The hand loom weavers, as a matter of fact, continued to require the same time as before, but for all that, the product of 1 hour of their labor represented after the change only half an hour's social labor, and consequently fell to one half its former value. We see then that which determines the magnitude of the value of any article is the amount of labor socially necessary, or the labor time socially necessary for its production. Each individual commodity in this connection is to be considered as an average sample of its class. Commodities, therefore, in which equal quantities of labor are embodied, or which can be produced in the same time, have the same value. The value of one commodity is to the value of any other, as the labor time necessary for the production of the one is to that necessary for the production of the other. As values, all commodities are only definite masses of a congealed labor time. The value of a commodity would therefore remain constant if the labor time required for its production also remained constant. But the latter changes with every variation in the productiveness of labor. This productiveness is determined by various circumstances, amongst others by the average amount of skill of the workmen, the state of science, and the degree of its practical application. The social organization of production, the extent and capabilities of the means of production, and by physical conditions, for example, the same amount of labor in favorable seasons is embodied in 8 bushels of corn, and in unfavorable only in 4. The same labor extracts from rich mines more metal than from poor mines. Diamonds are of very rare occurrence on the earth's surface, and hence their discovery costs on average a great deal of labor time. Consequently, much labor is represented in a small compass. Jacob doubts whether gold has ever been paid for at its full value. This applies still more to diamonds. According to Eschwege, the total produce of the Brazilian diamond mines for the 80 years ending in 1823 had not realized the price of 1.5 years' average produce of the sugar and coffee plantations of the same country, although the diamonds cost much more labor and therefore represented more value. With richer mines, the same quantity of labor would embody itself in more diamonds, and their value would fall. If we could succeed at a small expenditure of labor in converting carbon into diamonds, their value might fall below that of bricks. In general, the greater the productiveness of labor, the less is the labor time required for the production of an article. The less is the amount of labor crystallized in that article, and the less is its value, and vice versa. The less the productiveness of labor, the greater is the labor time required for the production of an article, and the greater is its value. The value of a commodity, therefore, varies directly as the quantity and inversely as the productiveness of the labor incorporated in it. A thing can be a use value without having value. This is the case whenever its utility to man is not due to labor, such are air, virgin soil, natural meadows, etc. A thing can be useful and the product of human labor without being a commodity. Whoever directly satisfies his wants with the produce of his own labor creates, indeed, use values, but not commodities. In order to produce the latter, he must not only produce use values, but use values for others, social use values, and not only for others without more. The medieval peasant produced quit rent corn for his feudal lord, and tithe corn for his parson. But neither the quit rent corn nor the tithe corn became commodities by reason of the fact that they had been produced for others. To become a commodity, a product must be transferred to another whom it will serve as a use value by means of an exchange. Lastly, nothing can have value without being an object of utility. If the thing is useless, so is the labor contained in it. The labor does not count as labor and therefore creates no value. Two, the twofold character of the labor embodied in commodities. At first sight, a commodity presented itself to us as a complex of two things, use value and exchange value. Later on, we saw also that labor, too, possesses the same twofold nature, for so far as it finds expression in value, it does not possess the same characteristics that belong to it as a creator of use values. I was the first to point out and to examine critically this twofold nature of the labor contained in commodities, as this point is the pivot on which a clear comprehension of political economy turns, we must go more into detail. Let us take two commodities, such as a coat and 10 yards of linen, and let the former be double the value of the latter, so that if 10 yards of linen equals W, the coat equals 2W. The coat is a use value that satisfies a particular want. Its existence is the result of a special sort of productive activity, the nature of which is determined by its aim, mode of operation, subject, means, and result. The labor, whose utility is thus represented by the value and use of its product, or which manifests itself by making its product a use value, we call useful labor. In this connection, we consider only its useful effect. As the coat and the linen are two qualitatively different use values, so also are the two forms of labor that produce them, tailoring and weaving. Were these two objects not qualitatively different, not produced respectively by labor of different quality, they could not stand to each other in the relation of commodities. Coats are not exchanged for coats. One use value is not exchanged for another of the same kind. To all the different varieties of values in use, there correspond as many different kinds of useful labor, classified according to the order, genus, species, and variety to which they belong in the social division of labor. This division of labor is a necessary condition for the production of commodities, but it does not follow conversely that the production of commodities is a necessary condition for the division of labor. In the primitive Indian community, there is social division of labor without production of commodities, or, to take an example nearer home, in every factory, the labor is divided according to a system, but this division is not brought about by the operatives mutually exchanging their individual products. Only such products can become commodities with regard to each other, as a result from different kinds of labor, each kind being carried on independently and for the account of private individuals. To resume, then, in the use value of each commodity, there is contained useful labor, i.e., productive activity of a definite kind and exercised with a definite aim. Use values cannot confront each other as commodities unless the useful labor embodied in them is qualitatively different in each of them. In a community, the produce of which in general takes the form of commodities, i.e., in a community of commodity producers, this qualitative difference between the useful forms of labor that are carried out on independently by individual producers, each on their own account, develops into a complex system of social division of labor. Anyhow, whether the coat be worn by the tailor or by his customer, in either case it operates as a use value. Nor is the relation between the coat and the labor that produced it altered by the circumstance that tailoring may have become a special trade, an independent branch of the social division of labor. Wherever the want of clothing forced them to it, the human race made clothes for thousands of years, without a single man becoming a tailor. But coats and linen, like every other element of material wealth that is not the spontaneous produce of nature, must invariably owe their existence to a special productive activity, exercised with a definite aim, an activity that appropriates particular nature-given materials to particular human wants. So far, therefore, as labor is a creator of use value, it is useful labor. It is a necessary condition, independent of all forms of society, for the existence of the human race. It is an eternal, nature-imposed necessity, without which there can be no material exchanges between man and nature, and therefore no life. The use values, coat, linen, etc., for example, the bodies of commodities, are combinations of two elements, matter and labor. If we take away the useful labor expended upon them, a material substratum is always left, which is furnished by nature without the help of man. The latter can work only as nature does, that is, by changing the form of matter. Nay, more, in this work of changing the form, he is constantly helped by natural forces. We see, then, that labor is not the only source of material wealth, of use values produced by labor. As William Petty puts it, labor is its father, and the earth its mother. Let us now pass from the commodities considered as a use value to the value of commodities. By our assumption, the coat is worth twice as much as the linen, but this is a mere quantitative difference which, for the present, does not concern us. We bear in mind, however, that if the value of the coat is double that of 10 yards of linen, 20 yards of linen must have the same value as one coat. So far as they are values, the coat and the linen are things of a like substance, objective expressions of essentially identical labor. But tailoring and weaving are qualitatively different kinds of labor. There are, however, states of society in which one and the same man does tailoring and weaving alternately, in which case these two forms of labor are mere modifications of the labor of the same individual, and not special and fixed functions of different persons. Just as the coat which our tailor makes one day, and the trousers which he makes another day, imply only a variation in the labor of one and the same individual. Moreover, we see at a glance that in our capitalist society, a given portion of human labor is, in accordance with the varying demand, at one time supplied in the form of tailoring, at another in the form of weaving. This change may possibly not take place without friction, but take place it must. Productive activity, if we leave out of sight its special form vis-a-vis the useful character of the labor, is nothing but the expenditure of human labor power. Tailoring and weaving, though qualitatively different productive activities, are each a productive expenditure of human brains, nerves, and muscles, and in this sense are human labor. They are but two different modes of expending human labor power. Of course, this labor power, which remains the same under all its modifications, must have attained a certain pitch of development before it can be expanded into a multiplicity of modes. But the value of a commodity represents human labor in the abstract, the expenditure of human labor in general, and just as in society, a general or a banker plays a great part, but mere man, on the other hand, a very shabby part. So here, with mere human labor, it is the expenditure of simple labor power, i.e., of the labor power which, on an average, apart from any special development, exists in the organism of every ordinary individual. Simple average labor, it is true, varies in character in different countries and at different times, but in a particular society it is given. Skilled labor counts only as simple labor intensified, or rather, as multiplied simple labor, a given quantity of skilled being considered equal to a greater quantity of simple labor. Experience shows that this reduction is constantly being made. A commodity may be the product of the most skilled labor, but its value by equating it to the product of simple unskilled labor represents a definite quantity of the latter labor alone. The different proportions in which different sorts of labor are reduced to unskilled labor as their standard are established by a social process that goes on behind the backs of the producers and consequently appears to be fixed by custom. For simplicity's sake, we shall henceforth account every kind of labor to be unskilled, simple labor, but this we do no more than save ourselves the trouble of making the reduction. Just as, therefore, in viewing the coat and linen as values, we abstract from their different use values, so it is with the labor represented by those values we disregard the differences between its useful forms, weaving, and tailoring. As the use values, coat and linen, are combinations of special productive activities with cloth and yarn, while the values, coat and linen, are, on the other hand, mere homogeneous conjugations of undifferentiated labor, so the labor embodied in these latter values does not count by virtue of its productive relation to cloth and yarn, but only as being expenditure of human labor power. Tailoring and weaving are necessary factors in the creation of the use values, coat and linen, precisely because these two kinds of labor are of different qualities, but only in so far as abstraction is made from their special qualities, only in so far as both possess the same quality of being human labor, do tailoring and weaving form the substance of the values of the same articles. Coats and linen, however, are not merely values, but values of definite magnitude, and according to our assumption, the coat is worth twice as much as the 10 yards of linen. Whence this difference in their values? It is owing to the fact that the linen contains only half as much labor as the coat, and consequently, that in the production of the latter, labor power must have been expended during twice the time necessary for the production of the former. While therefore, with reference to use value, the labor contained in a commodity counts only qualitatively, with reference to value it counts only quantitatively, and must first be reduced to human labor pure and simple. In the form case, it is a question of how and what, in the latter of how much. How long a time? Since the magnitude of the value of a commodity represents only the quantity of labor embodied in it, it follows that all commodities, when taken in certain proportions, must be equal in value. If the productive power of all the different sorts of useful labor required for the production of a coat remains unchanged, the sum of the values of the coat produced increases with their number. If one coat represents X days' labor, 2 coats represents 2 days' labor, and so on, but assume that the duration of the labor necessary for the production of a coat becomes doubled or halved. In the first case, 1 coat is worth as much as 2 coats were before. In the second case, 2 coats are only worth as much as 1 was before, although in both cases, 1 coat renders the same service as before, and the useful labor embodied in it remains of the same quality. But the quantity of labor spent on its production has altered. An increase in the quantity of use values is an increase of material wealth. With 2 coats, 2 men can be clothed. With 1 coat, only 1 man. Nevertheless, an increased quantity of material wealth may correspond to a simultaneous fall in the magnitude of its value. This antagonistic movement has its origin in the twofold character of labor. Productive power has reference, of course, only to labor of some useful concrete form, the efficacy of any special productive activity during a given time being dependent on its productiveness. Useful labor becomes, therefore, a more or less abundant source of products, in proportion to the rise or fall of its productiveness. On the other hand, no change in this productiveness affects the labor represented by value. Since productive power is an attribute of the concrete useful forms of labor, of course, it can no longer have any bearing on that labor, so soon as we make our abstraction from those concrete useful forms. However, then productive power may vary. The same labor, exercised during equal periods of time, always yields equal amounts of labor, but it will yield during equal periods of time different quantities of values in use. More if the productive power rise, fewer if it fall. The same change in productive power, which increases the fruitfulness of labor, and in consequence, the quantity of use values produced by that labor, will diminish the total value of this increased quantity of use values, provided such change shorten the total labor time necessary for their production, and vice versa. On the one hand, all labor is, speaking physiologically, an expenditure of human labor power, and in its character of identical abstract human labor, it creates and forms the value of commodities. On the other hand, all labor is the expenditure of human labor power in a special form and with a definite aim, and in this, its character of concrete useful labor, it produces use values. Three, the form of value or exchange value. Commodities come into the world in the shape of use values, articles or goods such as iron, linen, corn, etc. This is their plain, homely bodily form. They are, however, commodities only because they are something twofold, both objects of utility and, at the same time, depositories of value. They manifest themselves, therefore, as commodities, or have the form of commodities only in so far as they have two forms, a physical or natural form and a value form. The reality of the value of commodities differs in this respect from Dame Quickly that we don't know where to have it. The value of commodities is the very opposite of the coarse materiality of their substance. Not an atom of matter enters into its composition. Turn and examine a single commodity by itself as we will, yet in so far as it remains an object of value, it seems impossible to grasp it. If, however, we bear in mind that the value of commodities has a purely social reality, and that they acquire this reality only in so far as they are expressions or embodiments of one identical social substance vis-a-vis human labor, it follows as a matter of course that value can only manifest itself in the social relation of commodity to commodity. In fact, we started from exchange value or exchange relation of commodities in order to get at the value that lies hidden behind it. We must now return to this form under which value first appeared to us. Everyone knows, if he knows nothing else, that commodities have a value form common to them all, and presenting a marked contrast with the varied bodily forms of their use values. I mean their money form. Here, however, a task is set us, the performance of which has never yet even been attempted by bourgeois economy, the task of tracing the genesis of this money form, of developing the expression of value implied in the value relation of commodities, from its simplest, almost imperceptible outline to the dazzling money form. By doing this, we shall, at the same time, solve the riddle presented by money. The simplest value relation is evidently that of one commodity to some one other commodity of a different kind. Hence, the relation between the values of two commodities supplies us with the simplest expression of the value of a single commodity. A. Elementary or accidental form value. X commodity A equals Y commodity B, or X commodity A is worth Y commodity B. 20 yards of linen equals 1 coat, or 20 yards of linen are worth 1 coat. 1. The two poles of expression of value, relative form and equivalent form. The whole mystery of the form of value lies hidden in this elementary form. Its analysis, therefore, is our real difficulty. Here, two different kinds of commodities, in our example, the linen and the coat, evidently play two different parts. The linen expresses its value in the coat. The coat serves as the material in which that value is expressed. The former plays an active, the latter a passive part. The value of the linen is represented as the relative value or appears in relative form. The coat officiates as equivalent or appears in equivalent form. The relative form and the equivalent form are two intimately connected, mutually dependent, and inseparable elements of the expression of value, but at the same time are mutually exclusive, antagonistic extremes, i.e., poles of the same expression. They are allotted respectively to the two different commodities brought into relation by that expression. It is not possible to express the value of linen in linen. 20 yards of linen equals 20 yards of linen is no expression of value. On the contrary, such an equation merely says that 20 yards of linen are nothing else than 20 yards of linen, a definite quantity of the use value linen. The value of linen can therefore be expressed only relatively, i.e., in some other commodity. The relative form of the value of the linen presupposes, therefore, the presence of some other commodity, here the coat, under the form of an equivalent. On the other hand, the commodity that figures as the equivalent cannot at the same time assume the relative form. That second commodity is not the one whose value is expressed. Its function is merely to serve as the material in which the value of the first commodity is expressed. No doubt, the expression 20 yards of linen equals 1 coat, or 20 yards of linen are worth 1 coat, implies the opposite relation. 1 coat equals 20 yards of linen, or 1 coat is worth 20 yards of linen. But in that case, I must reverse the equation in order to express the value of the coat relatively, and so soon as I do that, the linen becomes the equivalent instead of the coat. A single commodity cannot therefore simultaneously assume in the same expression of value both forms. The very polarity of these forms makes them mutually exclusive. Whether, then, a commodity assumes the relative form or the opposite equivalent form depends entirely upon its accidental position in the expression of value. That is, upon whether it is the commodity whose value is being expressed or the commodity in which value is being expressed. 2. The relative form of value. A. The nature and import of this form. In order to discover how the elementary expression of the value of a commodity lies hidden in the value relation of two commodities, we must in the first place consider the latter entirely apart from its quantitative aspect. The usual mode of procedure is generally the reverse, and in the value relation nothing is seen but the proportion between definite quantities of two different sort of commodities that are considered equal to each other. It is apt to be forgotten that the magnitudes of different things can be compared quantitatively only when those magnitudes are expressed in terms of the same unit. It is only as expressions of such a unit that they are of the same denomination and therefore commiserable. Whether 20 yards of linen equals 1 coat, or equals 20 coats, or equals X coats, that is, whether a given quantity of linen is worth few or many coats, every such statement implies that the linen and the coats, as magnitudes of value, are expressions of the same unit, things of the same kind. Linen equals coat is the basis of the equation. But the two commodities whose identity identity of quality is thus assumed, do not play the same part. It is only the value of the linen that is expressed. And how? By its reference to the coat as its equivalent, as something that can be exchanged for it. In this relation, the coat is the mode of existence of value, is value embodied, for only as such is it the same as the linen. On the other hand, the linen's own value comes to the front, receives independent expression for it, is only as being value that it is comparable with the coat as a thing of equal value or exchangeable with the coat. To borrow an illustration from chemistry, butyric acid is a different substance from propylformate, yet both are made up of the same chemical substances, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, and that too in like proportions, namely C4H8O2. If now we equate butyric acid to propylformate, then in the first place, propylformate would be, in this relation, merely a form of existence of C4H8O2. And in the second place, we should be stating that butyric acid also consists of C4H8O2. Therefore, by thus equating the two substances, expression would be given to their chemical composition, while their different physical forms would be neglected. If we say that, as values, commodities are mere congealations of human labor, we reduce them by our analysis, it is true, to the abstraction value. But we ascribe to this value no form apart from their bodily form. It is otherwise in the value of relation of one commodity to another. Here, the one stands forth in its character of value by reason of its relation to the other. By making the coat the equivalent of the linen, we equate the labor embodied in the former to that in the latter. Now it is true that the tailoring which makes the coat is concrete labor of a different sort from the weaving which makes the linen. But the act of equating it to the weaving reduces the tailoring to that which is really equal in the two kinds of labor, to their common character of human labor. In this roundabout way, then, the fact is expressed that weaving also, in so far as it weaves value, has nothing to distinguish it from tailoring, and consequently is abstract human labor. It is the expression of equivalence between different sorts of commodities that alone bring into relief the specific character of value-creating labor, and this it does by actually reducing the different varieties of labor embodied in the different kinds of commodities to their common quality of human labor in the abstract. There is, however, something else required beyond the expression of the specific character of labor, of which the value of linen consists. Human labor, power, and motion, or human labor, creates value, but is not itself value. It becomes value only in its congealed state, when embodied in the form of some object. In order to express the value of the linen as a congelation of human labor, that value must be expressed as having objective existence, as being a something materially different from the linen itself, and yet a something common to the linen and all other commodities. The problem is already solved. When occupying the position of equivalent in the equation of value, the coat ranks qualitatively as the equal of the linen, as something of the same kind, because it is value. In this position, it is a thing in which we see nothing but value, or whose palpable bodily form represents value. Yet the coat itself, the body of the commodity coat, is a mere use value. A coat as such no more tells us it is value than does the first piece of linen we take hold of. This shows that when placed in value relation to the linen, the coat signifies more than when out of that relation, just as many a man strutting about in a gorgeous uniform counts for more than when in mufti. In the production of the coat, human labor power, in the shape of tailoring, must have been actually expended. Human labor is therefore accumulated in it. In this aspect, the coat is a depository of value, but though worn to a thread, it does not let this fact show through. And as equivalent of the linen, in the value equation. It exists under this aspect alone, counts therefore as embodied value, as a body that is value. A, for instance, cannot be your majesty to B, unless at the same time majesty in B's eyes assumes the bodily form of A, and what is more, with every new father of the people changes its features, hair, and many other things besides. Hence, in the value equation in which the coat is the equivalent of the linen, the coat officiates as the form of value. The value of the commodity linen is expressed by the bodily form of the commodity coat, the value of one by the use value of the other. As a use value, the linen is something palpably different from the coat. As value, it is the same as the coat, and now has the appearance of a coat. Thus, the linen acquires a value form different from its physical form. The fact that it is value is made manifest by its equality with the coat, just as the sheep's nature of a Christian is shown in his resemblance to the Lamb of God. We see then all that our analysis of the value of commodities has already told us, is told us by the linen itself, so soon as it comes into communication with another commodity, the coat. Only it betrays its thoughts in that language with which alone it is familiar, the language of commodities, in order to tell us that its own value is created by labor and its abstract character of human labor. It says that the coat, in so far as it is worth as much as the linen, and therefore is value, consists of the same labor as the linen, in order to inform us that its sublime reality as value is not the same as its buckram body. It says that the value has the appearance of a coat, and consequently that so far as the linen is value, it and the coat are as like as two peas. We may here remark that the language of the commodities has, besides Hebrew, many other more or less correct dialects. The German Wertschein, to be worth, for instance, expresses in a less striking manner than the Romance verbs valir, valor, valor, that the equating of commodity B to commodity A is commodity A's own mode of expressing its value. Paris is certainly worth a mass. By means, therefore, of value relation expressed in our equation, the bodily form of commodity B becomes the value form of commodity A, or the body of commodity B acts as a mirror to the value of commodity A. By putting itself in relation with commodity B as value in propria persona, as the matter of which human labor is made up, the commodity A converts the value in use B into the substance in which to express its A's own value. The value of A, thus expressed in the use value of B, has taken the form of relative value. B. Quantitative determination of relative value. Every commodity whose value it is intended to express is a useful object of given quantity, as 15 bushels of corn or 100 pounds of coffee. And a given quantity of any commodity contains a definitive quantity of human labor. The value form must therefore not only express value generally, but also value in definite quantity. Therefore, in the value relation of commodity A to commodity B, of the linen to the coat, not only is the latter as value in general made the equal in quality of the linen, but a definite quantity of coat, one coat, is made the equivalent of a definite quantity, 20 yards of linen. The equation 20 yards of linen equal one coat, or 20 yards of linen are worth one coat, implies that the same quantity of value, substance, congealed labor, is embodied in both. That the two commodities have each cost the same amount of labor, of the same quantity of labor time, but the labor time necessary for the production of 20 yards of linen, or one coat, varies with every change in the productiveness of weaving or tailoring. We have now to consider the influence of such changes on the quantitative aspect of the relative expression of value. 1. Let the value of linen vary, that of the coat remaining constant. If, say, in consequence of the exhaustion of flax growing soil, the labor time necessary for the production of the linen be doubled, the value of the linen will also be doubled. Instead of the equation 20 yards of linen equals 1 coat, we should have 20 yards of linen equals 2 coats. Since 1 coat would now contain only half the labor time embodied in 20 yards of linen. If, on the other hand, in consequence, say, of improved looms, this labor time be reduced by 1/2, the value of the linen would fall by 1/2. Consequently, we should have 20 yards of linen equals 1/2 coat. The relative value of commodity A, i.e. its value expressed in commodity B, rises and falls directly as the value of A, the value of B being supposed constant. 2. Let the value of linen remain constant, while the value of the coat varies. If under these circumstances, in consequence, for instance, of a poor crop of wool, the labor time necessary for the production of a coat becomes doubled. We have, instead of 20 yards of linen equals 1 coat, 20 yards of linen equals half a coat. If, on the other hand, the value of the coat sinks by 1/2, then 20 yards of linen equals 2 coats. Hence, if the value of the commodity A remained constant, its relative value expressed in commodity B rises and falls inversely as the value of B. If we compare the different cases in 1 and 2, we see that the same change of magnitude and relative value may arise from totally opposite causes. Thus, the equation of 20 yards of linen equals 1 coat becomes 20 yards of linen equals 2 coats, either because the value of the linen has doubled or because the value of the coat has fallen by 1/2, and it becomes 20 yards of linen equals half a coat. Either because the value of the linen has fallen by 1/2 or because the value of the coat has doubled. 3. Let the quantities of labor time respectively necessary for the production of the linen and the coat vary simultaneously, in the same direction and in the same proportion. In this case, 20 yards of linen continue equal to 1 coat, however much their value may have altered. Their change of value is seen as soon as they are compared with a third commodity whose value has remained constant. If the value of all commodities rose or fell simultaneously and in the same proportion, their relative values would remain unaltered. Their real change of value would appear from the diminished or increased quantity of commodities produced in a given time. 4. The labor time respectively necessary for the production of the linen and the coat, and therefore the value of these commodities, may simultaneously vary in the same direction, but at unequal rates, or in the opposite directions, or in other ways. The effect of all these possible different variations on the relative value of a commodity may be deduced from the results of 1, 2, and 3. Thus, real changes in the magnitude of value are neither unequivocally nor exhaustively reflective in their relative expression, that is, in the equation expressing the magnitude of relative value. The relative value of a commodity may vary, although its value remains constant. Its relative value may remain constant, although its value varies. And finally, simultaneous variations in the magnitude of value and in that of its relative expression by no means necessarily correspond in amount. Three, the equivalent form of value. We have seen that commodity A, the linen, by expressing its value in the use of value of a commodity differing in kind, the coat, at the same time impresses upon the latter a specific form of value, namely that of the equivalent. The commodity linen manifests its quality of having a value by the fact that the coat, without having assumed it a value form different from its bodily form, is equated to the linen. The fact that the latter therefore has a value is expressed by saying that the coat is directly exchangeable with it. Therefore, when we say that a commodity is in the equivalent form, we express the fact that it is directly exchangeable with other commodities. When one commodity, such as a coat, serves as the equivalent of another, such as linen, and coats consequently acquire the characteristic property of being directly exchangeable with linen, we are far from knowing in what proportion the two are exchangeable. The value of the linen being given in magnitude, that proportion depends on the value of the coat, whether the coat serves as the equivalent in the linen as relative value, or the linen as the equivalent in the coat as relative value. The magnitude of the coat's value is determined independently of its value form by the labor time necessary for its production. But whenever the coat assumes in the equation of value the position of equivalent, its value acquires no quantitative expression. On the contrary, the commodity coat now figures only as a definite quantity of some article. For instance, 40 yards of linen are worth what? 2 coats. Because the commodity coat here plays the part of equivalent, because the use value coat, as opposed to the linen, figures as an embodiment of value. Therefore, a definite number of coats suffices to express the definite quantity of value in the linen. 2 coats may therefore express the quantity of value of 40 yards of linen, but they can never express the quantity of their own value. A superficial observation of this fact, namely, that in the equation of value, the equivalent figures exclusively as a simple quantity of some article of some use value, has misled Bailey, as also many others, both before and after him, into seeing in the expression of value merely a quantitative relation. The truth being that when a commodity acts as equivalent, no quantitative determination of its value is expressed. The first peculiarity that strikes us in considering the form of the equivalent is this: use value becomes the form of manifestation, the phenomenal form of its opposite value. The bodily form of the commodity becomes its value form. But mark well that this quid pro quo exists in the case of any commodity B only when some other commodity A enters into a value relation with it, and then only within the limits of this relation. Since no commodity can stand in the relation of equivalent to itself, and thus turn its own bodily shape into the expression of its own value, every commodity is compelled to choose some other commodity for its equivalent, and to accept the use value, that is to say, the bodily shape of that other commodity as the form of its own value. One of the measures that we apply to commodities as material substances, as use values, will serve to illustrate this point. A sugar loaf, being a body, is heavy, and therefore has weight, but we can neither see nor touch this weight. We then take various pieces of iron, whose weight has been determined beforehand. The iron, as iron, is no more the form of manifestation of weight than is the sugar loaf. Nevertheless, in order to express the sugar loaf as so much weight, we put it into a weight relation with the iron. In this relation, the iron officiates as a body representing nothing but weight. A certain quantity of iron therefore serves as the measure of the weight of the sugar, and represents in relation to the sugar loaf weight embodied, the form of manifestation of weight. This part is played by the iron only within this relation, into which the sugar or any other body whose weight has to be determined enters with the iron. Were they not both heavy, they could not enter into this relation, and the one could therefore not serve as the expression of the weight of the other. When we throw both into the scales, we see in reality that as weight they are both the same, and that, therefore, when taken in proper proportions, they have the same weight, just as the substance iron, as a measure of weight, represents in relation to the sugar loaf weight alone, so in our expression of value, the material object, coat, in relation to the linen, represents value alone. Here, however, the analogy ceases. The iron is the expression of the weight of the sugar loaf, represents a natural property common to both bodies, namely, their weight. But the coat in the expression of value of the linen represents a non-natural property of both, something purely social, namely, their value. Since the relative form of value of a commodity, the linen, for example, expresses the value of that commodity as being something wholly different from its substance and properties, as being, for instance, coat-like, we see that this expression itself indicates that some social relation lies at the bottom of it. With the equivalent form, it is just the contrary. The very essence of this form is that the material commodity itself, the coat, just as it is, expresses value, and is endowed with the form of the value by nature itself. Of course, this holds good only so long as the value relation exists, in which the coat stands in the position of equivalent to the linen. Since, however, the properties of a thing are not the result of its relations to other things, but only manifest themselves in such relations, the coat seems to be endowed with its equivalent form, its property of being directly exchangeable, just as much by nature as it is endowed by the property of being heavy, or the capacity to keep us warm. Hence, the enigmatical character of the equivalent form, which escapes the notice of the bourgeois political economist, until this form, completely developed, confronts him in the shape of money. He then seeks to explain away the mystical character of gold and silver by substituting for them less dazzling commodities, and by reciting with ever renewed satisfaction the catalogue of all possible commodities which at one time or another have played the part of equivalent. He has not the least suspicion that the most simple expression of value, such as 20 yards of linen equals one coat, already propounds the riddle of the equivalent form for our solution. The body of the commodity that serves as the equivalent figures as the materialization of human labor in the abstract, and is at the same time the product of some specifically useful concrete labor. This concrete labor becomes therefore the medium for expressing abstract human labor. If on the one hand the coat ranks as nothing but the embodiment of abstract human labor, so, on the other hand, the tailoring, which is actually embodied in it, counts as nothing but the form under which that abstract labor is realized. In the expression of value of the linen, the utility of the tailoring consists not in making clothes, but in making an object, which we at once recognize to be value, and therefore to be a congelation of labor, but of labor indistinguishable from that realized in the value of the linen. In order to act as such a mirror of value, the labor of tailoring must reflect nothing besides its own abstract quality of being human labor generally. In tailoring, as well as in weaving, human labor power is expanded. Both, therefore, possess the general property of being human labor, and may therefore, in certain cases, such as in the production of value, have to be considered under this aspect alone. There is nothing mysterious in this, but in the expression of value there is a complete turn of the tables. For instance, how is the fact to be expressed that weaving creates the value of the linen, not by virtue of being weaving as such, but by reason of its general property of being human labor? Simply by opposing to weaving that other particular form of concrete labor, in this instance tailoring, which produces the equivalent of the product of weaving, just as the coat in its bodily form becomes a direct expression of value, so now does tailoring a concrete form of labor appear as the direct and palpable embodiment of human labor generally. Hence, the second peculiarity of the equivalent form is that concrete labor becomes the form under which its opposite, abstract human labor, manifests itself. But because this concrete labor, tailoring in our case ranks as, and is directly identified with, undifferentiated human labor, it also ranks as identical with any other sort of labor, and therefore with that embodied in the linen. Consequently, although, like all other commodity-producing labor, it is the labor of the private individuals, yet, at the same time, it ranks as labor directly social in its character. This is the reason why it results in a product directly exchangeable with other commodities. We have then a third peculiarity of the equivalent form, namely, that the labor of private individuals takes the form of its opposite, labor directly social in its form. The two latter peculiarities of the equivalent form will become more intelligible if we go back to the great thinker who was the first to analyze so many forms, whether of thought, society, or nature, and amongst them also the form of value. I mean Aristotle. In the first place, he clearly enunciates that the money form of commodities is only the further development of the simple form of value, i.e., of the expression of the value of one commodity in some other commodity taken at random. For he says, 5 beds equals 1 house, is not to be distinguished from 5 beds equals so much money. He further sees that the value relation which gives rise to this expression makes it necessary that the house should qualitatively be made the equal of the bed, and that without such an equalization these two clearly different things could not be compared with each other as commiserable quantities. Exchange, he says, cannot take place without equality, and equality not without commiserability. Here, however, he comes to a stop and gives up the further analysis of the form of value. It is, however, in reality impossible that such unlike things can be commiserable, i.e., qualitatively equal. Such an equalization can only be something foreign to their real nature, consequently only a makeshift for practical purposes. Aristotle, therefore, himself tells us what barred the way to his further analysis. It was the absence of any concept of value. What is that equal something, that common substance, which admits of the value of the beds being expressed by a house? Such a thing, in truth, cannot exist, says Aristotle. And why not? Compared with the beds, the house does represent something equal to them, and so far as it represents what is really equal, both in the beds and the house, and that is human labor. There was, however, an important fact which prevented Aristotle from seeing that to attribute value to commodities is merely a mode of expressing all labor as equal human labor, and consequently as labor of equal quality. Greek society was founded upon slavery, and had, therefore, its natural basis the inequality of men and of their labor powers. The secret of the expression of value, namely, that all kinds of labor are equal and equivalent, because, and so far as they are human labor in general, cannot be deciphered until the notion of human equality has already acquired the fixity of a popular prejudice. This, however, is possible only in a society in which the great mass of produce of labor takes the form of commodities, in which, consequently, the dominant relation between man and man is that of owners of commodities. The brilliancy of Aristotle's genius is shown by this alone, that he discovered in the expression of the value of commodities a relation of equality. The peculiar conditions of the society in which he lived alone prevented him from discovering what, in truth, was at the bottom of this equality. Get a little water. Four, the elementary form of value considered as a whole. The elementary form of value of a commodity is contained in the equation expressing its value relation to another commodity of a different kind, or an exchange relation to the same. The value of commodity A is qualitatively expressed by the fact that commodity B is directly exchangeable with it. Its value is quantitatively expressed by the fact that a definite quantity of B is exchangeable with a definite quantity of A. In other words, the value of a commodity obtains independent and definite expression by taking the form of exchange value. When at the beginning of this chapter we said in common parlance that a commodity is both a use value and an exchange value, we were, accurately speaking, wrong. A commodity is a use value, or objective of utility. Hold on a second. There we go. Where were we? It manifests itself as this twofold thing, that it is, as soon as its value assumes an independent form vis-a-vis the form of exchange value, it never assumes this form when isolated, but only when placed in a value or exchange relation with another commodity of a different kind. When once we know this, such a mode of expression does no harm. It simply serves as an abbreviation. Our analysis has shown that the form or expression of the value of a commodity originates in the nature of value, and not that value and its magnitude originate in the mode of their expression as exchange value. This, however, is the delusion as well of the mercantilists and their recent revivers, Ferrier-Ganil and others, as also of their antipodes, the modern bagmen of free trade, such as Bastiat. The mercantilists lay special stress on the qualitative aspects of the expression of value, and consequently on the equivalent form of commodities, which attains its full perfection in money. The modern hawkers of free trade, who must get rid of their article at any price, on the other hand, lay most stress on the quantitative aspect of the relative form of value. For them, there consequently exists neither value nor magnitude of value anywhere except in its expression by means of the exchange relation of commodities, that is, in the daily list of prices current. MacLeod, who has taken upon himself to dress up the confused ideas of Lombard Street in the most learned finery, is a successful cross between the superstitious mercantilists and the enlightened free trade bagmen. A close scrutiny of the expression of the value of A in terms of B, contained in the equation expressing the value relation of A to B, has shown us that, within that relation, the bodily form of A figures only as a use value, the bodily form of B only as the former aspect of value. The opposition or contrast existing internally in each commodity between use value and value is therefore made evident externally by two commodities being placed in such relation to each other, that the commodity whose value it is sought to express figures directly as a mere use value, while the commodity in which that value is to be expressed figures directly as mere exchange value. Hence, the elementary form of value of a commodity is the elementary form in which the contrast contained in that commodity between use value and value becomes apparent. Every product of labor is, in all states of society, a use value, but it is only at a definite historical epoch in a society's development that such a product becomes a commodity, vis-a-vis at the epoch when the labor spent on the production of a useful article becomes expressed as one of the objective qualities of that article, i.e., as its value. It therefore follows that the elementary value form is also the primitive form under which a product of the labor appears historically as a commodity, and that the gradual transformation of such products into commodities proceeds pari passu with the development of the value form. We perceive, at first sight, the deficiencies of the elementary form of value. It is a mere germ, which must undergo a series of metamorphoses before it can ripen into the price form. The expression of the value of commodity A in terms of any other commodity B merely distinguishes the value from the use value of A, and therefore places A merely in relation of exchange with a single different commodity, B. But it is still far from expressing A's qualitative equality and quantitative proportionality to all commodities. To the elementary relative value form of a commodity, there corresponds the single equivalent form of one other commodity. Thus, in the relative expression of value of the linen, the coat assumes the form of equivalent or of being directly exchangeable only in relation to a single commodity, the linen. Nevertheless, the elementary form of value passes by an easy transition into a more complete form. It is true that by means of the elementary form, the value of commodity A becomes expressed in terms of one, and only one, other commodity, but that one may be a commodity of any kind, coat, iron, corn, or anything else. Therefore, according as A is placed in relation with one or the other, we get for one and the same commodity different elementary expressions of value. The number of such possible expressions is limited only by the number of the different kinds of commodities distinct from it. The isolated expression of A's value is therefore convertible into a series prolonged to any length of the different elementary expressions of that value. All right, I'm going to stop reading there. It's the end of that part. So I'm going to be right back and we'll game a bit. Don't go anywhere.